Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be exploring, this concept of boundaries,
Okay.
as outlined in the book, Boundaries. When to Say Yes, How to Say No by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah, so we're going to be kind of pulling out, key insights from the book to help you, the listener, really grasp, what are boundaries? Why are they so important?
And what I think is so intriguing about this book is that it goes beyond just saying set boundaries.
Right.
It digs into like, okay, why do we struggle with boundaries in the first place?
Yeah,
And then it gives you like those practical tools to actually start implementing them
I love
in
you.
your life.
Yeah, and I'm curious about, they talk about this idea of boundaries being like property lines for the soul. What do they even mean by that?
That's such a powerful analogy, right? Like, think about property lines in the physical world. Like, they define what you're responsible for,
Hmm.
what you own, what you have the right to protect. Boundaries, they function in a similar way, but for our inner lives, right? So they help
Hmm.
us define what we will and will not allow into our lives.
So it's like our emotional well-being, our time, our energy, all of that is part of our personal property,
Yes.
and we get to decide, who enters that space and under what conditions.
Precisely. And, just like with property lines, boundaries aren't about building walls to isolate ourselves, right? They're more like gates
Okay.
that can be opened to welcome the good in, but also closed to keep the harmful out.
And they use the parable of the Good Samaritan to kind of illustrate this point, right?
Yes. So the Samaritan crosses a boundary to help the injured man, even though it wasn't technically his responsibility,
Yeah.
he acted with compassion, right? Whereas, the priest and the Levite, they stayed within their perceived boundaries and missed that opportunity
To do good.
to do good.
Yeah. So it's not about these rigid rules. It's about having the wisdom to know, like, okay, when do we hold firm? And when do we maybe be a little more flexible, like the Samaritan?
Exactly. And this leads to the question, right, of how these boundaries actually develop in the first place.
Yeah.
And Cloud and Townsend, they argue that it all starts in childhood.
Okay, so like our experiences as kids really impact our ability to set boundaries later in life.
Absolutely. They outline these crucial stages like hatching, practicing, and rapprochement
Okay.
that are really key to how we develop our sense of self, and also our ability to set boundaries.
So like hatching is when, babies are first realizing they're separate from mom.
Right. That early phase when they start like realizing they're individuals,
Yeah.
big step.
Huge. And then you've got the practicing stage where, toddlers are all about testing limits, exploring, being assertive.
Oh, yes.
I can only imagine the chaos.
And it's fascinating how this manifests. This is when kids start saying no all the time, right? It's their first
Mhm.
attempt at verbalizing a boundary.
Oh, that's so interesting. This part of the book really got me thinking about my own childhood.
Yeah.
And like, I remember, being scolded for saying no to things,
Mhm.
even if I had a good reason.
Yeah.
Did you experience anything similar? It makes you wonder, like, how those early interactions might still be shaping our boundaries today, as
Yeah,
adults.
absolutely. It's incredibly influential, If parents punish or shame a child for, expressing those boundaries, it can create this like sense of fear around saying no later in life.
Right.
But if they respond with respect and understanding, they actually help their child develop that healthy sense of self
Mm.
and that right to set boundaries.
That makes a lot of sense. What about, you said rapprochement?
Yes. So this is where, children begin to realize that they can't do everything on their own, right?
Yeah.
They need their parents, and they start to kind of negotiate that need for independence with their need for connection, right?
Right.
It's a crucial period for developing healthy boundaries later in life.
So we're seeing how, like, these early experiences really set the stage
Yes.
for our adult relationships.
Mhm.
But the book doesn't shy away from, the fact that things can go wrong, right? It talks about different types of boundary problems people can develop.
Oh, for sure. They group these problems into three categories: compliance, controllers, and non-responsive.
Okay.
So compliance, those are the people who like struggle to say no, and they often overextend themselves.
Right, like they're constantly putting others' needs above their own.
Exactly. The book gives this example of Robert, who's constantly giving in to his wife's demands, even though it's causing him financial stress,
Oh, wow.
because he learned early on that saying no was bad.
Mm-hmm.
So he became a yes man, even to things that harm him.
That's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And then there's the controllers. Right.
Exactly. So these individuals, they have difficulty respecting other people's boundaries.
Yeah.
They need to be in charge, and they often manipulate situations to get their way, leaving others feeling bulldozed.
Like they use the example of Steve, who's this like boss who's constantly overstepping with his assistant Frank,
Oh, yes.
always calling him during dinner, expecting him to work late.
Steve can't hear no, you see, because he sees it as a challenge to overcome, not a boundary to be respected.
hmm So it's really interesting because, I mean, it sounds like these patterns are often stemming from deeper issues,
Yes.
like childhood experiences, trauma, difficult family dynamics.
Precisely. It's not just about personality types. It's about recognizing those deeper roots
Yeah.
of those behaviors.
Okay. And then we have the non-responsive folks.
Right. So these are the people who, like, they don't seem to register other people's needs or boundaries, you know?
Like that friend who borrows your car but never fills up the gas tank.
Exactly. They're not intentionally trying to be disrespectful, but, their lack of awareness creates this pattern of boundary violations.
Okay, so we've got these different types of boundary problems, and it's clear that, I mean, this is complex. But the book, it does provide some guidance, right? It talks about these 10 laws of boundaries.
Yes. These laws offer a framework for understanding how boundaries work and how to start setting them in your own life.
And for our listeners, I think one that's particularly relevant is the law of sowing and reaping.
Okay.
I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so the law of sowing and reaping, it basically emphasizes that actions have consequences.
Right.
And when we protect people from experiencing those consequences, whether it's, our kids or our spouses or even ourselves, we're actually, hindering their growth and
Right.
preventing them from learning, those important lessons.
Yeah, it's about allowing people to own their choices and face those natural outcomes.
Yes.
Even if it's uncomfortable. What really struck me about this law was how it applies to helping others.
Okay.
It's so tempting to want to rescue people from their problems, but
Yeah.
sometimes, the most loving thing we can do is step back and let them experience the consequences of their actions.
It's a difficult balance to strike, but it's essential for growth.
Yeah.
Another really crucial law is the law of responsibility.
Okay.
And this one is all about finding that balance between loving others and taking responsibility for ourselves.
Yeah, that resonates with me. I think a lot of us struggle with where do you draw the line between supporting someone
Yes.
and then taking on their burdens?
That's such a good point, and the book makes it so clear.
Yeah.
You can love someone deeply, but you can't feel their feelings for them.
Right.
You can't think their thoughts. You can't live their life for them.
Right. So they even use this example of saying that, you can't actually feel
Yes.
or think for another person
Exactly.
to illustrate this point.
It's so true.
It's a powerful reminder that each of us is responsible for our own inner world.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's like that saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Right? You can offer support, you can offer guidance, but ultimately each person has to make their own choices.
Exactly. And that brings us to the law of power,
Okay.
which is about accepting
Rather.
that we have limitations in changing others.
Yeah.
You can't control someone else's behavior no matter how much you may want to.
Oh, that's a tough one to swallow, especially if you're in a relationship where someone is consistently violating your boundaries. It's so easy to fall into that trap of thinking, if only they would change, everything would be okay.
Right. But the book offers a more empowering perspective, right? What you can do is change yourself and how you react to them.
Okay.
It's about focusing on what you can control, which is your own thoughts, your feelings, your actions,
Right.
rather than wasting energy on something that's ultimately outside your control.
So shifting from a mindset of trying to control them.
Yes.
Okay, how can I influence them
Yes.
through my own actions and boundaries?
Yeah, exactly. And then we have the law of exposure, which is another important one.
Okay.
And it highlights the importance of clear communication, even when it's uncomfortable.
Oh, man. That's something I've personally struggled with.
Mhm.
It's so easy to avoid those tough conversations or
Yeah.
just hope that people will get it
Right.
without us having to spell it out.
But expecting others to read our minds, it sets us up for resentment and frustration.
Right.
The book, it really emphasizes that, hiding your boundaries or hoping others will just intuit them
Yeah.
is not a recipe for success.
Right.
Clear communication, even if it feels awkward at first,
Yeah.
is crucial for building healthy relationships.
It's about being upfront about your needs
Yes.
and your limits
Yes.
and not expecting others to figure it out on their own.
And finally, the law of evaluation reminds us that setting boundaries, it's not a one-time thing, right? It's an ongoing process
Okay.
that requires us to regularly evaluate the effects of our boundaries
Yeah.
and be willing to adjust them.
If needed.
So it's not about setting a boundary in stone
Right.
and never revisiting it, but it's about recognizing that, like, our needs and circumstances change.
Yes.
And our boundaries need to kind of adapt accordingly.
Absolutely. They use this great example of like a husband considering his wife's feelings
Okay.
when making a decision to show how this law works in practice.
Yeah.
It's about being thoughtful, considerate,
Yeah,
and taking responsibility for how your boundaries impact others.
that makes sense. It's not just about, like, asserting our own needs, but it's about finding a balance
Yes,
that respects both our needs and the needs of others.
exactly.
Now, the book also addresses some comment like myths and misconceptions
It-
about boundaries, right?
Yes, these myths can be real roadblocks
Yeah,
for people trying to, set healthy boundaries.
yeah.
One of the biggest ones is this idea that boundaries are selfish.
I can see how people would, like, fall into that trap, especially if they've been conditioned to, like,
Always prioritize others' needs above their own.
and this myth often stems from this feeling that
Yeah.
you need to constantly put others' needs before your own, right?
Yeah.
But the book, it challenges that idea,
Okay.
arguing that saying no to protect your well-being is not selfish, but an act of stewardship over your resources, both physical and emotional.
It's like saying you can't pour from an empty cup, right?
Right.
You have to take care of yourself in order to be able to give to others
Exactly.
in a sustainable way.
Another common myth is the feel that setting boundaries will lead to rejection,
Okay.
right? So it's like, if I start setting boundaries, I'll be hurt by others.
Yeah, I think that's a very real fear for a lot of people, especially if they've been in relationships where they, felt punished or abandoned for expressing their needs.
Absolutely. But the book reframes boundaries as a defensive tool rather than an offensive weapon.
Okay.
Right? It's about protecting yourself from harm, not inflicting it on others.
So it's not about pushing people away. It's about setting those clear limits.
Exactly.
Protect yourself.
Saying no doesn't have to be aggressive or mean-spirited.
Right.
It can be a calm, firm statement of your limits. Ultimately, it's about creating those healthy boundaries that benefit both you and the other person.
And then there's this myth that, like, boundaries mean I'm angry.
Yes, this one
Right.
This one often trips people up because they associate setting boundaries with expressing anger or resentment.
Yeah.
And while anger can certainly be a sign that a boundary has been violated,
Yeah.
the book argues that setting healthy boundaries actually reduces the need for anger in the long run.
It's about recognizing your limits before they're pushed to the point of, like,
Yes,
anger and resentment.
exactly. It's like taking preventative measures
Yeah.
instead of waiting for things to explode.
It's about taking care of yourself and creating space for healthy, respectful relationships. So, we've covered what boundaries are, how they develop, these common myths, those 10 laws.
Yes.
Now, let's look at how all of this can be applied in, like, different areas of life.
Right, to do it.
So let's start with one of the most intimate
Okay.
and potentially boundary-blurring relationships.
Yeah.
Marriage.
Yes, marriage.
Marriage, that beautiful dance of, two becoming one. But it can sometimes make it hard to see where one person ends
Right.
and the other begins.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? It's
That's
easy
right.
to, like, lose yourself in the process.
Absolutely. And the book, emphasizes that boundaries are not about creating distance
Okay.
in marriage, but rather about fostering true intimacy
Big
within
bang.
that oneness.
So it's not about keeping secrets
Right.
or, like, building walls. It's about each person owning their thoughts, their feelings, their needs,
Yeah.
and communicating them clearly to their partner.
That clear communication is key.
Yes.
The book highlights how often, couples fall into patterns of just assuming
Oh, yeah.
their partner should just know what they're thinking or feeling.
Which, let's be honest, rarely ends well.
Right. So instead of expecting your spouse to be a mind reader,
Yeah.
practice expressing your needs and your limits directly.
Mm-hmm.
It might feel a little awkward at first, but that vulnerability can actually strengthen your connection.
It's about being honest with yourself
Yes.
and your partner about what you need
Mm-hmm.
to feel safe and respected
Yes.
in the relationship.
Absolutely. The book also discusses the importance of boundaries
Okay.
in parenting.
Ooh, parenting.
Yeah.
This one is so important. It is,
Yes.
because, as parents, it's natural to want to protect our kids
Right.
from discomfort and difficulty.
Yeah.
But, like, we can't shield them from everything.
We can, and the authors argue that setting boundaries with our kids, even when it's hard,
Yeah.
is one of the most loving things we can do.
It's about preparing them for the real world, right?
Yeah.
Where there are consequences for actions.
Yes.
And where they won't always get their way.
Think about it. Boundaries, they teach children responsibility, self-control, and respect for others. They help kids understand that actions have consequences and that they are ultimately responsible for their own choices.
The book provides some great examples, too, like setting age-appropriate limits on behavior, letting kids experience natural consequences for their actions.
Yes.
And, resisting the urge to rescue them from every little mishap.
It's about striking that balance between nurturing them and guiding them towards independence.
Okay, let's shift gears and talk about the workplace.
Okay.
Boundaries at work can be tricky.
They can.
Especially with, the lines between work and personal life.
Yes.
Becoming more and more blurred these days.
Absolutely. It's so easy to get caught up in that always-on culture and feel pressure to be available 24/7.
Right.
But having those clear boundaries in your professional life, it's essential for both your well-being and your productivity.
Absolutely. So, like, the book emphasizes, the importance of setting limits on your time and energy. What are some practical ways to do that?
It might mean learning to say no to unreasonable demands.
No.
Prioritizing your workload, respecting your own need for breaks and downtime. It's about setting those realistic expectations and communicating them clearly to your colleagues and your supervisors.
So, like, taking ownership of your time.
Yes.
And not letting work bleed into every aspect of your life.
Exactly. And it also means, being assertive about your role and your responsibilities, communicating your limits clearly, and not taking on tasks that are outside your job description.
And the book also touches on, like, the importance of emotional boundaries at work as well.
Oh, absolutely. It's about recognizing that, while a supportive work environment is important, it's not your job to fulfill all your emotional needs.
Right.
The book cautions against, expecting your colleagues or your company to become
a surrogate family.
That's an important distinction, right? Like, we can be friendly and supportive with colleagues.
Yes.
But, we shouldn't expect them to be our therapists or our primary source of emotional support.
It's about having those healthy boundaries in all areas of our lives, including the professional realm.
Okay. So we've covered relationships, parenting, work. What about boundaries with ourselves?
Ah, yes. The most important relationship of all.
Right. Because it's so easy to focus on setting boundaries with others.
Yes.
But what about setting those boundaries with ourselves?
And the book dives into this, right?
Oh.
The importance of setting those internal boundaries, which can be just as challenging, if not more so, than setting external boundaries.
Yeah, I can imagine, it takes a lot of, self-awareness and discipline.
It does.
To set those internal limits. What are, some examples of internal boundaries?
So internal boundaries are about things like, self-discipline, self-control, and self-care, right?
They're about recognizing your own limits and being willing to say no to yourself.
Yeah.
Right? So imagine you're constantly battling that inner critic, the voice that tells you you're not good enough or that you have to please everyone, right?
Right.
Setting internal boundaries is like saying enough to that voice.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing your own worth and refusing to let those negative thoughts run the show. What are some ways you try to, silence that inner critic?
I try to practice mindfulness and, really challenge those negative thoughts when they arise.
Yeah.
It's definitely an ongoing process.
It is.
But it, helps to cultivate a more compassionate inner dialogue.
And they offer, specific examples of how to do this in areas like, time management, task completion, and even self-talk, right?
Okay.
It's about recognizing those negative thought patterns or self-sabotaging behaviors and setting limits on them. One key aspect they highlight is this idea of delay of gratification.
Delay of gratification. That's a crucial skill for anyone.
It is.
Not just for setting boundaries.
Absolutely. A crucial skill for setting those healthy internal boundaries. It's about, resisting the urge for that instant gratification.
Right.
And being willing to work towards long-term goals, even if it means sacrificing some, immediate pleasure.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a world of instant gratification, so,
we do.
it's more important than ever to, cultivate that ability to delay gratification, and focus on the bigger picture.
And the book makes it clear that this is not about deprivation or being hard on yourself.
Okay.
Right? It's about making choices that align with your values and that ultimately lead to greater fulfillment and well-being.
So, like, making conscious choices
Yes.
that support your long-term goals rather than, giving in to every impulse or temptation.
Exactly. Now, all of that being said, setting boundaries, both internal and external, can be incredibly challenging.
Yeah.
Right? There's often a lot of resistance, both from ourselves and from the people around us.
Yeah. It's not always easy to stand up for ourselves and say no,
It's not.
especially if, we're used to pleasing others or avoiding conflict.
Right.
So, like, what advice does the book offer?
Well, the book,
Overcoming that resistance.
it acknowledges those challenges and it offers some practical tips
Okay.
for overcoming that resistance. One thing it encourages you to do is to identify, the fears and the potential losses associated with setting boundaries. So, like, what are you afraid might happen
Yeah.
if you start setting firmer boundaries in your life?
Yeah, I think one of my biggest fears is like disappointing others or like damaging relationships.
Okay.
It's easy to fall into that trap of thinking that, like saying no
Right.
will make people angry or reject me.
That's a common fear. And the book addresses it directly.
Okay.
They emphasize that healthy boundaries actually strengthen relationships in the long run
Yeah.
because they create a foundation of respect and authenticity.
Yeah.
Right. It might feel uncomfortable at first, but ultimately,
Yeah.
clear boundaries lead to healthier, more fulfilling connections.
So it's about like shifting that perspective from like
Yes.
seeing boundaries as something that like pushes people away
Mm-hmm.
to something that actually like invites them in
Yes,
to a more authentic relationship with us.
exactly. And remember, setting boundaries, it's a journey, not a destination. It takes time, practice,
Yeah.
and a willingness to be uncomfortable sometimes.
Right.
But the rewards,
Yeah.
greater peace, freedom, and fulfillment, are well worth the effort.
Mm.
And they share this powerful story in the book
Yeah.
of a woman who finally, like, confronts her husband about his behavior, but, she does it with the help of her therapist. And it emphasizes, like, how facing those fears and taking that step, even though it was really difficult, it led to positive changes in
Okay.
her relationship. It's about, recognizing that while setting boundaries can be uncomfortable,
Yeah.
in the short term, it creates space for greater freedom,
Yeah.
peace, and authenticity in the long run.
Yeah, it's like ripping off a Band-Aid.
Right.
It might sting at first,
Right.
but then the healing can begin.
Exactly. And they also talk about the importance of, like, seeking support,
Okay.
right? Whether it's from trusted friends, mentors, or a therapist. Having that support system in place
Yeah.
can make all the difference when you're navigating
Right.
those, challenges of setting boundaries.
Yeah, it's so important to remember that you don't have to do this alone.
You don't.
Right. There are people who care about you
Mm-hmm.
and want to support you on this journey.
Absolutely. And the book also emphasizes the role of prayer and spiritual grounding in this process.
Yeah, that resonates with me. I've found that when I connect with, my faith, it gives me a sense of strength and courage to face those difficult situations.
Absolutely. It reminds us that, relying on a higher power can provide that strength, guidance, and courage
Yeah.
when we're, facing those difficult conversations or making those tough decisions.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
And it's clear that, boundaries are not a simple topic.
They're not.
Right. It's nuanced. It's multifaceted.
Mm-hmm.
It requires, both understanding and action.
Absolutely. But the insights from boundaries, they can truly help you create that roadmap
Yeah.
for building those healthier, more fulfilling relationships in all areas of your life.
Yeah. I love how this book gives you like both the why and the how. It's like it helps you understand the deeper reasons behind boundary issues.
Yes.
But then it gives you the practical tools to start making changes.
Exactly.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something we talked about earlier.
Okay.
This idea of boundaries being like property lines for the soul.
I love that analogy.
Right. It's such a clear and visual way
It is.
to understand this concept.
And it raises a really important question.
Okay.
If our boundaries are like property lines,
Yeah.
what does it mean to have good fences and gates?
I'm intrigued. Break it down for me.
Okay, well, just like with physical property, right? Having good fences means being clear about where your boundaries lie.
Okay.
It means knowing what you're responsible for, what you're not responsible for, and what you're willing to tolerate.
It's about that self-awareness we talked about.
Yes.
Right? Recognizing your own needs, limits, values.
Yeah.
Like you have to know where your property line is
Exactly.
before you can build a fence around it.
Exactly. And then the gates, those represent like those points of entry and exit.
Okay.
Right? They symbolize your ability to choose who and what you allow into your life.
So just like with a physical gate,
Yes.
you get to decide when to open it, when to close it, who gets a key.
Who has access?
Right.
Is it?
It puts you in control.
It's about having that agency and control over your own life. Yeah. And I think that sense of agency, that's what can be so transformative for people who've struggled with boundaries.
Right. It's about moving from a place of feeling like a victim of other people's, demands and expectations to a place of empowerment where, like, you get to make conscious choices.
Yes.
About how you want to live and who you want to be.
It's not about isolating yourself or pushing people away.
Right.
It's about creating those healthy, respectful relationships where everyone feels safe and valued.
So for our listener, what would you say is like the most important takeaway from this, deep dive into boundaries?
Here's a final thought to consider. Boundaries are not about pushing people away.
Okay.
They're about inviting them into a healthier and more authentic relationship with you. How can you start creating those spaces in your life today?
That's such a beautiful way to put it.
Thank you.
Right. Like boundaries are about creating a space for deeper, more meaningful connections.
They are.
It's not about shutting people out. It's about inviting them in on your terms.
Yes.
In a way that honors both your needs and theirs.
Exactly. And remember, it's a journey, not a destination.
Yes.
Be patient with yourself. Seek support when you need it and keep practicing.
Yeah.
The freedom and the peace that come with healthy boundaries are well worth the effort.
Thank you so much for guiding us through this deep dive into boundaries. It's been an enlightening conversation.
Yes.
And for our listener, keep exploring this concept.
Yes.
Apply the insights from boundaries, when to say yes, how to say no to your own life, and see what positive changes unfold.
Happy diving.